International news now.
Okay, we want to start today with some background on the Afghan Civil War and America's role in it. And this background is important to show just how complicated this conflict is and to understand how the final, rather disastrous outcome so far was an accumulation of many years of decisions made by several American presidential administrations and by Afghan political actors. And we are going to examine this background in a series of steps. First, we are going to provide a short explanation of the various political forces that are in conflict in the Afghan Civil War. And then we're going to look at the U.S. military intervention in Afghanistan after the 9/11 terrorist attacks by al-Qaeda. We will go step by step through a timeline of the major developments in the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations' execution of the war in Afghanistan. We will examine President Bush's logic for invading Afghanistan in reaction to a terrorist attack by a group given sanctuary in that country. And then we will look at President Obama's revision of military strategy in Afghanistan, concentrating on the 2009 surge and the killing of Osama bin Laden. And finally, we will examine President Trump's approach to Afghanistan and his consequential peace deal with the Taliban. So this whole discussion is intended to set up our debate, if you will, of the reasoning and trade-offs involved in President Biden's decision to end the war that his predecessors seemingly could not.
So let's first start with a breakdown of the major ethnic divisions and political groupings in conflict in the Afghan Civil War. And I think it's important to realize that Afghanistan is a fractured society with a wide range of political, military, and social groups. Different ethno-linguistic groups compete and have competed for centuries with one another for resources and power. This complex collection of ethnic and tribal identities make governance by any central authority extremely difficult. And it's important to realize both the Soviet Union and the United States tried to establish a functioning state in Afghanistan in the last 40 years, and both ultimately failed.
And Great Britain before it, too.
Yes, and Great Britain before it. So let's talk a little bit more about these cleavages and distinctions within Afghanistan. So the major ethnic groups and their share of Afghanistan's population, according to the CIA World Factbook estimates from 2013, are shown on the following slide. And so let's begin with the Pashtun. About 40 to 42% of the population. This is the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan. It's concentrated in the southern part of the country, which is also the geographic stronghold of the Taliban. It's important to realize, too, that there are lots of Pashtun also in Pakistan over the border. And they share common interests, and this is going to shape Pakistan's interests with respect to the Taliban and its desire to maintain close relations with the Taliban. So the Tajiks are the second largest group in Afghanistan at about 27%. Tajiks are concentrated in the northern provinces and comprise the core of the opposition militia that fought the Taliban from 1996 until the American invasion in 2001. And Tajiks ultimately played a critical role in the subsequent Afghan army as well. So the Hazaras is the largest Shia Muslim minority in Afghanistan. It's about 9% of the population. And this is a group that's been historically persecuted by the Taliban, a Sunni Muslim group. Now, other important ethnic minorities include the Uzbeks, Turkmen, and the Baluch, and they provide further ethnic competition and conflict, particularly in regions where they are concentrated. Now, when thinking about the larger military and political conflict nationwide in Afghanistan, the main ethnic division is between the Pashtuns and various non-Pashtun groups. So, complicating things even further, though, certain ethnic groups, specifically the Pashtuns and the Baluchis, also have a tribal structure that dominate local politics in regions where they dominate. So some local tribal leaders within the Pashtun ethnic group, for example, came into conflict with the government of Hamid Karzai, himself a Pashtun, when he did not provide sufficient state resources to their communities, right? So the larger point here is that there are multiple and competing layers of political, ethnic, and social divisions in Afghanistan that make it incredibly difficult to establish a stable, functioning state that can claim legitimate authority over each one of these groups.
Yeah, and the key point to make about this ethnic diversity and the complications of it is that the United States didn't seem to really appreciate and understand the ethnic divisions in the country and how that would overlay and kind of complicate the conflict with, say, the Taliban or terrorist groups within the country. And so it's just another layer of complication. And so in addition to this underlying ethnic division in Afghan society, which is hard enough to try to figure out a way to govern such a complex array of interests, there are a myriad of other different political entities and organizations that have been vying for power in Afghanistan since the American invasion in 2001, and many of them even before then, right? And these political organizations are the main political actors that we typically see covered in the media as the main players in the Afghan civil war. They often coincide roughly with some of the ethnic cleavages in Afghan society, but not always, and they're not the same as simply the ethnic groups. And so the slide kind of outlines this, the next slide outlines these different groups, and I'm going to describe them one at a time. And so the first and the most famous or infamous really is the Taliban. And this is an Islamist movement that arose at around 1994 amid this political chaos that followed the Soviet withdrawal. When the Soviet Union was expelled from Afghanistan, there was sort of a power vacuum, and in its place emerged in one group, the Taliban, that tried to fill that vacuum. And they were based primarily in rural areas of Kandahar province, which is a Pashtun heartland in the south. And they sort of provided an answer, if you will, to the basic need of the population for security and stability. They promised to impose Islamic law. They were going and campaigned, if you will, on a battle against corruption of the powerful warlords that ruled in different localities. And they first and foremost wanted and tried to assure the population that they could provide security. And so in 1996, the Taliban came to power in most of Afghanistan, and they declared an Islamic emirate, imposing a harsh interpretation of the Quran and enforcing it with various levels of repression and violence: floggings, amputations, mass executions, and strict restrictions on women, including keeping girls out of schools. Now, another political entity, the Northern Alliance, also emerged at about this time. It was a military alliance of rebel groups that operated from 1996 to 2001, and it fought a war with the Taliban and against the Taliban after the Taliban captured Kabul and declared the Islamic Emirate. And after the invasion of the United States and its ability to force the Taliban from power in 2001, the Northern Alliance basically dissolved, and its component parts generally supported the new Afghan interim administration. And some of the members of this Northern Alliance later became part of the government of Hamid Karzai. There's also a couple of terrorist groups that operate in Afghanistan and are important players. And so the most famous one is Al-Qaeda, a global Islamist terrorist group formed by Osama bin Laden. We all know him, and other foreign fighters who had their start really in Afghanistan because they volunteered to fight the Soviet occupation there. And Al-Qaeda was given sanctuary in Afghanistan, and from their training bases and other cells, this group carried out attacks on Western countries, most famously the 9/11 attacks on the United States. And so Al-Qaeda if nothing else, play this huge role because it was their attack on the United States that brought the United States into Afghanistan. Now, there's also another terrorist group, the Islamic State, or ISIS, and it is a global Islamist group that formed from an offshoot of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And ISIS declared an Islamic caliphate in large parts of Iraq and Syria beginning in 2013, and eventually they controlled a lot of territory about the size of Great Britain in those two countries, and pose a real threat against the West and their neighbors. And an American-led coalition of a number of countries and other groups like the Kurds eventually drove ISIS out of its territorial holdings. But ISIS didn't, despite certain claims, completely disappear. ISIS-K, which is getting a lot of notoriety right now, is one evidence of that. It is the Afghanistan affiliate of ISIS, and it targets and it operates then in Afghanistan as a loosely tied organization to the main organization of ISIS. And it targets the United States and its allies, but it is also hostile to the Taliban, which it claims is not sufficiently strict in its application of Islamic law. Now, another force in Afghan politics and in the civil war are warlords, and these are ethnic and tribal leaders who control local politics and governance, and they are often come into conflict with the national government or international forces, and so they are just another layer and another element that you have to work with or work around at times to try to govern Afghanistan.
Do you want me to take the next couple?
Yeah, sure.
So we should talk about Pakistan and the United States. And we need to recognize that Pakistan is an important regional power. And generally, they've supported the Taliban in Pakistan, which has generated real conflict between the United States and Pakistan. Why have they supported the Taliban? Because the Pakistani government believes that they need a political partner in Afghanistan in case, in the long run, they get into a potential war with India. And so what they want and what they need is strategic depth, the possibility that they can flee or move into Afghanistan in an extended land war with India. Now, India has over time tried to establish good relationship with ethnic groups in the Northern Alliance, and this has been threatening to the Pakistani government. And so Pakistan has historically tried to maintain good relations with the Taliban for this reason, because of its conflict with India. And again, this has put Pakistan and the United States at odds over what the composition of the Afghan state was going to look like.
And it's really complicated and undermined the American war effort there, because what Pakistan as a neighboring country provided was a safe haven, if you will. I mean, all the Afghan rebels and Taliban had to do when they were getting beat back by American forces was flee into Pakistan, and they had safe haven, right? And that was something that was a real sore spot for U.S.-Pakistani relations, and they're supposed to be allies.
Yes. No, and this is exactly what happens after the United States defeats the Taliban in the fall of 2001. Key Taliban leaders simply move into Pakistan, and they reconstitute the movement there over the next couple of years before then they launch an extended offensive, retaking southern parts of the country in 2006. And so they really use Pakistan as a strategic refuge, so to speak, to reconstitute their movement.
Right, and this is why when they killed Osama bin Laden, he was hiding out not in Afghanistan, but in Pakistan.
Yeah. So finally, let's talk a little bit about the United States. The U.S. is part of a long list of great powers that invaded Afghanistan and tried to establish and support a centralized governing Afghan state. The American invasion in 2001 quickly removed the Taliban from power, but then the United States ultimately failed in establishing a new Afghan state that was broadly consensual and incorporated all these diverse segments into the Afghan state, so that it could effectively govern the state, hold power without American military backing. All right, so let's now turn a little bit to the U.S. actions in Afghanistan and begin with the war in Afghanistan that begins formally in October of 2001, but the U.S. had special forces on the ground before then. And this war is precipitated by the attacks on 9/11 by Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda had been receiving sanctuary and had training bases set up in Afghanistan, received sanctuary from the Taliban and has the blessing of the Taliban to be there. Right. This precipitates American intervention. The United States demanded that the Taliban surrender Osama bin Laden. There were backdoor negotiations that went on between the United States, principally led by the CIA station chief in Pakistan, with the Taliban. Ultimately, the Taliban believed that the United States would have attacked or demanded new concessions in the future. And they also worried that their domestic legitimacy would collapse because so many Afghans and the Taliban supported what bin Laden had done. They worried that surrendering bin Laden to the United States would undermine their domestic foundations of power. So we get a stalemate. The Bush administration launches this war. And part of this war is the Bush administration's larger grand strategy that the United States isn't going to make a distinction between terrorist groups and states that supported them. This was a deterrent effort to the rest of the international system, other states, that if you support terrorists, you're going to become on our enemy list and we're coming for you because terrorism is such an existential threat to the United States.
Yeah,
and
we've got a quote here on the slide that's like, you got to pick a side.
Yep.
Either you're going to, and you don't have to engage in terrorism. Either you're going to be with us and actively fight against terrorism, or you're going to be complicit in terrorism, even if you're not a terrorist organization. If you're a state that allows this to happen on your territory, then you're on the list.
So the United States launches Operation Enduring Freedom on October 7, 2001 to defeat Al-Qaeda, to take out Osama bin Laden and those who perpetrated the attack, and to throw the Taliban out of power in Afghanistan. The military operation is, frankly, in those first few months, a remarkable success. The U.S. is coordinating with the Northern Alliance in the north, controlling the air, and providing special operations support. The Northern Alliance does significant components of the fighting, and they defeat the Taliban quickly in the first 3 or 4 months, and this is largely a success. The United States then helps appoint, participates in a domestic political process that brings Hamid Karzai to power as the leader of an American-backed interim government. He then becomes the subsequent president after we have presidential elections and legislative elections. In May of 2003, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declares the end of major combat, and then a new constitution is adopted in preparation for presidential elections in 2004. However, it's important to realize that a Taliban resurgence begins fairly quickly. They begin reconstituting themselves 2003, preparing for what ultimately will be a substantial offensive in southern Afghanistan in 2006. And so then in 2006, we get an escalation of violence and tensions or conflict begins to emerge in the international coalition that's fighting with the United States.
Because it's not just the United States that are in Afghanistan, there's the whole NATO alliance, and all these countries contributed troops and were suffering casualties, and they started to question the mission and what the mission was and how long they were going to be there, because there was this resurgence and there was this.
And I think it's important to realize, too, let's remember the strategic context about what's going on in the United States and its role in the world at this time. 2003, the U.S. invades Iraq.
Right.
And the attention of the Pentagon and the national security establishment reorients to Iraq because they believe that the situation in Afghanistan is trending in the right direction and stable, and they really miss, as a result, this reconstitution of the Taliban's power in 2004 and 2005.
Yeah. And that's a whole other conversation that we can't get into right now, but the war in Iraq really undermine the war in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan was seen as a pretty legitimate exercise. I mean, there was a real attack. It came from actors in Afghanistan. The United States was not, just invading Afghanistan to get rid of the Taliban. The Taliban gave safe harbor to a real threat to the United States, and so it seemed like there was broad international and domestic support for this. And then it went pretty well at first. And then the invasion of Iraq really started to introduce all these cracks, and people started questioning what exactly the United States was after. And so then we get to the Obama administration. Let's jump ahead a little bit. And when Obama takes office, he introduces a new strategy in Afghanistan that includes a major escalation of American troop deployments. And this may be surprising to many, since President Obama is associated with opposing the Iraq war. That's one of the reasons he gained election in 2008 and withdrawing American troops there. And he did that. But upon entering office in 2009, what President Obama did was he recommits to the war in Afghanistan while simultaneously drawing down forces in Iraq with the logic, really, that Afghanistan was the right place and the most important front of the U.S. war against terrorism. And so he just wanted to reorient the force posture into Afghanistan. So he sort of doubles down, if you will, on the war in Afghanistan. He conducts a review of strategy in Afghanistan, and that review concludes that American force deployment was simply too small to satisfactorily quell the Taliban insurgency that was concentrated in the south of the country. And so Obama orders a surge of about 33,000 additional troops to Afghanistan, on top of an already pretty high level of troops, which in part were redirected from Iraq into Afghanistan at 68,000, and that then took the total up to over 100,000 troops. Now that's a lot of American troops, and it's important to sort of note the difference in scale here between that and what ultimately, the reduction that ultimately came toward the end of the war. And so the slide shows Obama's surge marked the high point, the highest number of both American troops deployed in Afghanistan and American casualties from combat. And so now Obama's new strategy emphasized a new counterinsurgency doctrine that was successful in Iraq that sought to protect Afghan civilians from these terrorist attacks. And this meant limiting civilian casualties in counterterrorism operations and establishing military outposts around the country that could protect people from insurgents like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And the training then of the Afghan army was ramped up to take on this protection responsibility. And the Obama administration was also determined to root out corruption in the government, which was an endemic problem in this whole mission throughout the duration of American occupation in Afghanistan, because it was the corruption of the Afghan state that the United States was supporting that really complicated and even drove recruitment into the ranks of rebel forces like the Taliban. And so they had to try to root out the corruption so Afghans would trust their government more and support it. So that strategy also sought to disrupt terrorist safe havens in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. And this is why Pakistan is an important point here. Despite being an American ally and one of the largest recipients of American foreign aid, Pakistan, for reasons we already noted, provided a safe haven for Taliban fighters who could simply flee across the border into Pakistan to gain safety from American forces because it was in their strategic interests, because they needed that good relation for any future conflict in the region with, say, India. So on the counterterrorism front, the Obama administration also conducted various missions and scored perhaps the greatest success of the war on terror, the killing of Osama bin Laden. And so on May 1st, 2011, U.S. forces, Special Op Forces, killed Osama bin Laden, who was the architect of the 9/11 attacks, who was in a compound in Pakistan, which shows the relevance of Pakistan here. And although this was seen as a significant achievement, the death of the leader of Al-Qaeda also complicated the military mission in Afghanistan because it increased pressure to draw down forces there. Because if the United States went into Afghanistan not to nation build, not to construct a post-Taliban democracy, but instead just to fight terrorism, if you kill off the guy who orchestrated 9/11 and there hasn't been any more big-time terrorist attacks from the region, then people are going to start saying, well, like, why are we still there and what's our mission now? And so President Obama then, after all of these developments, starts to draw down that surge. He announces an outline to remove the surge troops by the summer of 2012 and end the combat mission in Afghanistan by December 2014. And after that, withdraw most of the troops by 2016. And so this is a recurrent theme here. Every president tries to end the Afghanistan war. Obama had a plan. He wanted to be the guy who ended it by the end of his second term, but he didn't get it done because there were signs that if the United States fully withdrew, there would be a resurgence. And so critics pointed to Obama's decisions to draw down these troops as a mistake because of the resilience of the Taliban insurgency that was still there in the South. And they said it was premature.
So let's turn now to how the Trump administration executed the war in Afghanistan. Trump's candidacy and presidency was really marked a sharp departure from previous administrations and many basic tenets of U.S. foreign policy in general. Trump ran for president criticizing the wars in the Middle East, started by Republican George W. Bush and continued by Democrat Barack Obama. He campaigned promising to end, quote, forever wars. However, upon taking office, Trump engages in an open-ended military commitment, saying his decisions about withdrawal would ultimately be based on conditions on the ground rather than arbitrary timelines. But increased violence and attacks by the Taliban, particularly in Kabul, seem to push Trump to change course again. And so in 2019, he begins peace talks with the Taliban. And then the United States signs an agreement in 2020 that offers a dramatic reduction of U.S. troops and eventually a full withdrawal of U.S. troops by May 1st, 2021. This timeline is important given the change in administrations in the United States. So it sets a marker that the U.S. would be out by May 2021. And in exchange, the expectation was, and the Taliban agreed to, not letting Afghanistan become a haven for terrorists like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And the Taliban agreed to stop attacking U.S. service members. Right before he leaves office, President Trump announced plans to cut U.S. troop size in half, down to 2,500 by January down to 2,500, and this is days before Biden is inaugurated.
Okay. So now we have this summary of what previous American presidents did and did not do in Afghanistan, and so we're going to spend the second half of our session today discussing President Biden's decision to fully withdraw. And the one thing that becomes abundantly clear after examining all of these policies by the three presidents preceding Biden is that they all promised to draw down and even withdraw completely from Afghanistan, and all of them found reasons to hold back and to continue the American presence at some level. And so it was Biden who broke this pattern, for better or for worse. And the crisis that Biden now finds himself in is partly helps to explain why his predecessors were ultimately unwilling to pull the trigger on this full assessment. Is that, you think that's a fair?
I think it is, right? And I think it's important to, so it's clear that the administration's public support is, I don't want to say collapsing, but deteriorating significantly in the last couple of weeks.
That might bounce back, you know.
It might bounce back. This could be temporary, but it's also clear that Biden broke a 20-year cycle.
Right.
And he broke a cycle, and if you're following the news and reading a lot of op-eds and a lot of the hand-wringing going on, assessing U.S. policy and criticizing U.S. policy as a huge failure, talks about the momentum that this policy had in place and the entrenched interests in Washington, D.C., in Republicans, Democrats, and particularly the Pentagon, that was so hesitant to withdraw. And so you have President Obama comes to office, wants to withdraw, gets pushed into, he would say, gets pushed to the surge in 2009. Same thing with President Trump, wants to come in, clearly wants to pull back, consistently wants to pull back, gets talked out of it. And
establishes the peace talks, wanting to get out before his term to help get reelected, and gets talked out of it.
Yeah. And Biden breaks the cycle.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we can see the power here of the interests in maintaining this policy, given the costs now, the political costs that Biden is likely to face over the coming months and potentially in the midterms. But
okay, so let's break down Biden's rationale here in favor of full withdrawal, despite all the problems and the risks. And so we're going to do that by showing 3 clips from a press conference that Biden gave after the Taliban suddenly and unexpectedly swept into Kabul and took over Afghanistan before anybody expected it would. And so each of these clips provides one of 3 distinct and interrelated parts of Biden's logic. And so we're going to go ahead and take them one by one. And so let's go ahead and run the first clip.
I want to remind everyone how we got here and what America's interests are in Afghanistan. We went to Afghanistan almost 20 years ago with clear goals. Get those who attacked us on September 11th, 2001, and make sure al-Qaeda could not use Afghanistan as a base from which to attack us again. We did that. We severely degraded al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We never gave up the hunt for Osama bin Laden, and we got him. That was a decade ago. Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy. Our only vital national interest in Afghanistan remains today what it has always been: preventing a terrorist attack on America's homeland. I've argued for many years that our mission should be narrowly focused on counterterrorism, not counterinsurgency or nation building. That's why I opposed the surge when it was proposed in 2009 when I was vice president. And that's why, as president, I'm adamant that we focus on the threats we face today in 2021, not yesterday's threats. Today, the terrorist threat has metastasized well beyond Afghanistan. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Nusra in Syria, ISIS attempting to create a caliphate in Syria and Iraq, and establishing affiliates in multiple countries in Africa and Asia. These threats warrant our attention and our resources. We conduct effective counterterrorism missions against terrorist groups in multiple countries where we don't have permanent military presence. If necessary, we'll do the same in Afghanistan. We've developed counterterrorism over-the-horizon capability that will allow us to keep our eyes firmly fixed on the direct threats to the United States in the region and act quickly and decisively if needed.
Okay, so let's make a few points here. First, Biden makes the argument that the U.S. achieved its counterterrorism goals in Afghanistan a long time ago with the killing of Osama bin Laden 10 years ago, and the degrading of terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda by destroying their bases and killing their leaders and breaking up their cells, disrupting their day-to-day operations. And one of the, perhaps you could argue one of the sources of evidence there is there wasn't another 9/11. And so he argues that we already achieved our goal. And so even though there's a lot of talk about failure, this first argument is, we did what we should have been our narrow goal. We did it a long time ago. And so this argument, I think, can be read as a critique of the Obama administration, which Biden served in as vice president, because he's essentially saying we should have left 10 years ago under Obama. And he consistently has noted that he was a harsh critic within the administration of Obama's surge. He was against it. He wanted to withdraw then. And then the second thing that Biden claims here is that the withdrawal will not mean the return of terrorist groups that we largely marginalized during the U.S. occupation. So he claims that the United States can effectively continue to engage in this so-called over-the-horizon counterterrorism in Afghanistan without a military presence on the ground there. And this means the U.S. will continue to stage counterterrorism missions and attacks just from outside of Afghanistan's territory. And in fact, the 2 drone strikes that were used against ISIS-K following the terrorist attack by that group on the Kabul airport are examples of this over-the-horizon capability. Those drones came from outside of Afghanistan and launched those attacks. And so the key issue here is whether this claim is accurate about over-the-horizon capability. That'll be one of the most important factors determining whether the withdrawal turns out to be the right or the wrong decision. And as we'll see, critics are very skeptical that we can actually keep terrorist groups from returning to Afghanistan in force without military boots on the ground, and because the Taliban has taken over the country.
So let's move on to argument 2. In the next clip, Biden argues that the deal that President Trump made with the Taliban forced his hand into making the decision for full withdrawal. So let's go ahead and roll that clip.
When I came into office, I inherited a deal that President Trump negotiated with the Taliban. Under his agreement, U.S. forces would be out of Afghanistan by May 1, 2021, just a little over 3 months after I took office. U.S. forces had already drawn down during the Trump administration from roughly 15,500 American forces to 2,500 troops in country. And the Taliban was at its strongest militarily since 2001. The choice I had to make as your president was either to follow through on that agreement or be prepared to go back to fighting the Taliban in the middle of the spring fighting season. There would have been no ceasefire after May 1. There was no agreement protecting our forces after May 1. There was no status quo of stability without American casualties after May 1. There was only the cold reality of either following through on the agreement to withdraw our forces or escalating the conflict and sending thousands more American troops back into combat in Afghanistan, lurching into the 3rd decade of conflict. I stand squarely behind my decision.
So if the previous clip was a critique of President Obama, this argument is a critique of President Trump and his peace deal with the Taliban. Many commentators have argued that Trump made a bad deal with the Taliban by giving too many concessions surrounding quick and complete withdrawal on an explicit deadline and then got little in return. What Biden is arguing here is that Trump's peace deal resulted in a choice between 2 difficult options. Either Biden follow through on Trump's promise of quick and complete withdrawal, despite all the risks and challenges of getting all the Americans and Afghan allies out, or he escalate the conflict once again and pour more American troops into Afghanistan, right? And he notes that there was a huge risk to doing this because now there are only 2,500 U.S. troops in country right at the beginning of the fighting season in the summer. And there's an important seasonality to the fighting and the intensity of it. It's much more intense outside of the winter months. And so what he's saying is U.S. troops were going to have been vulnerable. And so in a sense, this was a trap. If I escalate here, then we've got to stay in this longer and longer. So, but why did, this is an important though political framing, right? Why did Biden take this all in or all out approach? Right? He's arguing that his hands were tied. Why couldn't the U.S. just extend the withdrawal? Trump's May 1st deadline had already passed, after all, and Biden's new deadline of withdrawal by September 11th, the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, was self-imposed and seemed based on symbolism. So what Biden argues is the Taliban would have escalated the conflict. According to Biden, the Taliban would have claimed that any indefinite extension of American occupation in order to have a more orderly evacuation would have been taken as the United States breaking its agreement. Remember, under the agreement, the Taliban promised not to attack U.S. forces or allies' forces as long as the United States was making progress with the full withdrawal. If the Taliban thought that the United States was not really going to withdraw, then it would have started to attack U.S. forces again. And if that would have occurred, then the Biden administration would have been pushed into adding more troops to that now small contingent of 2,500 troops that were left in the country. Right? So therefore, according to Biden, Trump's peace deal tied his hands. It left him with a choice to either get out by August or go back in. And Biden decided to get out. But what's he doing here? He wants to share responsibility for the messiness of this quick withdrawal by placing some of the blame on Trump's peace deal. Again, we don't know that this would have unfolded as Biden claims, and many critics argue that he had more options than he claims.
Okay. So let's now move to Biden's third argument for withdrawal. And in this argument, Biden simply claims that America's larger goals of nation building were a failure, and full withdrawal was necessary to avoid perpetrating that failure forever. So let's roll the clip where he sort of articulates this argument.
After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. That's why we're still there. We were clear-eyed about the risks. We planned for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I would be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves. We spent over $1 trillion. We trained and equipped an Afghan military force with some 300,000 strong, incredibly well equipped, a force larger in size than the militaries of many of our NATO allies. We gave them every tool they could need. We paid their salaries, provided for the maintenance of their Air Force, something the Taliban doesn't have. Taliban does not have an Air Force. We provided close air support. We gave them every chance to determine their own future. What we could not provide them was the will to fight for that future. There's some very brave and capable Afghan special forces units and soldiers. But if Afghanistan is unable to mount any real resistance to the Taliban now, there is no chance that 1 year, 1 more year, 5 more years, or 20 more years of U.S. military boots on the ground would have made any difference. And here's what I believe to my core. It is wrong to order American troops to to step up when Afghanistan's own armed forces would not. The political leaders of Afghanistan were unable to come together for the good of their people, unable to negotiate for the future of their country when the chips were down. They would never have done so while U.S. troops remained in Afghanistan, bearing the brunt of the fighting for them.
Okay, so this last argument is pretty straightforward for withdrawal. Basically, Biden argues that the United States lost the war in Afghanistan and needs to face up to the fact once and for all, and face up to it by getting out. And our occupation and the $2 trillion spent in total building up the Afghan state and its military and its economy simply did not produce a viable governing entity in Afghanistan. And we weren't the first ones to fail at this, right? Soviets, British before us. Staying any longer, he argues, would not change that inescapable fact. And so from this perspective, the immediate collapse of the Afghan military and government was not a demonstration that Biden was wrong about full withdrawal, but proves that he was right, that we needed to leave because we should not lose another American life or spend more billions of dollars in this losing cause, that we should just finally get out. And that getting out may be the only way that Afghanistan figures out for itself how to build a sustainable state that can provide a modicum of security and stability for its people. And so that's his three arguments.
All right, so let's try to land this plane. We're going to conclude with an examination of the other side of the debate. As you might expect, Republican critics have argued, and Democratic critics have argued that Biden made a colossal mistake in this withdrawal. We're going to show a clip from Representative Dan Crenshaw, Republican from Texas, who lays out the case for sustaining a U.S. military presence in Afghanistan, basically indefinitely. So let's roll that clip now.
Congressman, you've been there. You know what it's like. I know you are angry about what's happening, and it's not political for you. You warned against the withdrawal when President Trump announced his plan. Now you are very unhappy with how the withdrawal is playing out. Can you explain to us why we needed to stay?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's fundamental to this entire debate because, look, you have a lot of people who've been using emotional slogans to drive foreign policy. They say, bring the troops home, no more endless wars. And that's fine, but here's the reality on the ground. There's two choices that we have. Okay, you either have a residual security force or you have an Islamic authoritarian emirate that is killing people and providing a safe haven for terrorists and bringing us right back to the situation that was pre-9/11. Now, that doesn't make people feel very good when you lay out those options, but those indeed are the options. And this was always going to happen if we withdrew in a hasty manner. And even if even if the Biden administration had done this better, which they certainly did not, it probably would have happened in 6 months from now. And the question would be, what do we get out of that? I mean, we make some people feel good because, again, they like to repeat those slogans, and it makes them feel good to bring troops home. But we would get no other benefit from it. And in fact, we've made the world a lot more dangerous as a result. And let me say one more thing on this. I think people have been unable to distinguish between nation building with 100, 200,000 troops, which is, I think we all agree, is a waste, especially in a place like Afghanistan. But they've been unable to distinguish between that and a residual security force that does limited counterterrorism operations. Like, to call this an endless war is a little bit strange because we haven't had a combat casualty in 18 months. You know, there was no political need to do this. There was no strategic need to do this in such a hasty way. And it's just so disappointing.
So you believe we just should have stayed the course or changed the mission entirely? Because people here might say, I don't know, $2 trillion, 2,400 lives, that seems expensive.
It is expensive. Again, nation building is expensive, but we stopped nation building a long time ago. And people have been unable to distinguish between these two strategies. A residual security force is what we've been doing for the last few years. And that's worked well enough. I mean, what we ended up in Afghanistan was a bit of a stalemate where we're supporting the Afghan government against an insurgency of Taliban fighters that wants to create a safe haven for terrorism. And so those are your options. I mean, neither are great options, right? But to believe otherwise is to live in a fictional world. And we have to live in the real world on this. And that's what I've been trying to explain to people on my side, on the Democrat side, for years now, that it would end up like this.
You can argue that we need to be in Afghanistan so we can have our eyes on insurgents and terrorists. But this morning, we heard National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan say that there are terrorist threats all over the world, Yemen, Somalia. He said we can't have thousands of troops everywhere there's a threat. So how do you respond to that?
He needs to look at his own force footprint because he doesn't even know what he's talking about. We have troops everywhere. There's special operations guys like me in well over 100 countries. And what do we do there? We advise, we assist, we do training missions with host nation governments so that their government doesn't turn into a failed state, right? Because a failed state does have consequences around the world, and especially in a place like Afghanistan. So we already do this, and nobody seems to complain about it. He talks about Yemen. We've been doing operations in Yemen forever. So it's just not true.
Well, then is it fair to complain about what's happening in Afghanistan? We did those training missions. We worked with the government. And now you blink and the Afghan government walks. I mean, we spent $88 billion on training the Afghan military. Did they just give up?
Yeah, I mean, they did, obviously. But look, and that hurts my heart as much as anybody else. But we can't fall into the sunk cost fallacy on this. Just because we spent a lot of money doesn't mean we should cut and run. And you also have to understand it from on the ground perspective here. You know, let's say it's 20 years of training and building up an army. That's not a lot of time in the grand timeline of history. It's actually a very short amount of time. They don't have a lot of foundations there. You know, the primary reason that American forces are so effective is because of our logistics system. They don't really have that. It takes a lot more time to build that up. And frankly, we got to a point where they needed a very minimal support mechanism from the United States in order to do the job of keeping the country afloat. Okay, it was very minimal. We only had a few thousand troops there. And we had air support. We had eyes and ears on the ground. We weren't losing any Americans. Again, we haven't lost an American in 18 months there. So, you know, we had the balance right, and then we threw it all away.
Can I just ask, I know we're out of time, then how do you feel personally, as somebody who fought against the Taliban in the front lines, watching things fall so quickly? How do you feel this morning?
It's heart-wrenching. What I do want to say this to my veterans and to Gold Star families. It does not mean that our sacrifices were in vain. It is not the case at all. Because the reason that we were over there was to prevent them from having the operational space and timing to plan an attack here. And you know what? For 20 years, we never had another 9/11. So I think everybody should be sleeping easy. Your sacrifices were not in vain.
So Crenshaw makes several important critiques here. First, he claims that the United States ultimately found the right balance in Afghanistan, that this balance could have been sustained at an acceptable cost in U.S. casualties and treasure for the foreseeable future. Second, notice that Crenshaw implicitly rejects Biden's all-in or all-out approach. He claims that no one is arguing that the United States should double down on its occupation or its mission. Crenshaw says instead that the U.S. ended nation building long ago and was in a standoff with the Taliban. Although the small contingent force left in Afghanistan could not defeat the Taliban or even prevent it from controlling large parts of Afghanistan, it could prevent the Taliban from taking power completely, overrunning Kabul, or allowing terrorist groups to operate. Therefore, Crenshaw argues that Biden did have a third choice other than full withdrawal or escalation. The status quo could have been maintained with a small residual force and low U.S. casualties. This was not a perfect solution, he argues, but avoided a far worse possible outcomes, such as the return of power of the Taliban or the resurgence of terrorist groups like ISIS-K in Afghanistan. According to Crenshaw and other critics, the American war effort in Afghanistan was not a complete failure, and consequently Biden's total military withdrawal sacrificed the meaningful accomplishments of keeping the Taliban and terrorist groups at bay and returned the situation to a pre-2001 scenario.